Before Carolina became rich from rice, the colony was running out of answers. Founded in 1670, it faced disease, unstable food supplies, failed crop experiments, and investors who still had no reliable export to keep their dream alive. Many settlements were dangerously fragile, and one bad harvest or delayed supply ship could leave families facing hunger. Then came a cruel contradiction. European slave ships bought African rice to feed crews and captives during Atlantic voyages that often lasted 6 to 8 weeks. Oral traditions also tell of African women braiding rice seeds into their hair before being forced aboard. Could the crop that helped rescue Carolina have arrived with the very people the colony refused to recognize as human? Those women received no land, wages, or credit. Their knowledge made fortunes while their names disappeared from the record. This is Hidden Black Chronicles, and together we bring buried stories back into the light. Tonight, we follow the hidden seeds that helped transform the American South. Part 1. Before rice saved Carolina, the colony was running out of answers. Before rice covered the Carolina Lowcountry in fields of gold, the colony was a place of hunger, disease, failed harvests, and frightened investors who had begun to wonder whether their expensive experiment would ever survive. English settlers founded Charlestown in 1670 on the coast of what later became South Carolina. They arrived expecting rich land, easy profits, and another plantation economy, like the ones already producing tobacco in Virginia and sugar in the Caribbean. Instead, they found a hot, wet region where unfamiliar diseases killed people quickly, crops failed without warning, and many families lived much closer to hunger than the grand colonial histories later admitted. The entire American South was not literally dying from one great famine, but parts of the young Carolina colony remained dangerously fragile. Food supplies could be disrupted by storms, poor harvests, disease, war, and the slow arrival of ships. At the same time, colonial leaders were desperate to find a crop that could be sold overseas for enough money to keep settlers, merchants, and wealthy landowners from abandoning the colony. They tried wine, silk, olives, tobacco, and several other products. None of them gave Carolina the dependable fortune its backers had promised themselves. The land looked rich, but richness on a map meant little when colonists did not know how to use the wetlands stretching around them. Then, rice entered the story, and American history later made its arrival sound almost effortless. A familiar version claimed that an English sea captain brought a bag of rice seed from Madagascar and handed it to a Carolina planter. The seed was planted, the crop grew, and a great southern industry was born. It was a clean story with a white captain, a white landowner, and an empty landscape waiting for their discovery. The missing people were already living on the other side of the Atlantic. For centuries, communities along the western coast of Africa had grown rice under conditions that would have defeated many European farmers. The region stretched across parts of present-day Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Traders came to call it the Rice Coast because rice stood at the center of local farming, trade, food, and family life. People there had domesticated their own species of rice, now known as Oryza glaberrima, long before the founding of Carolina. Temne, Mende, Balanta, Susu, Mandinka, and other communities knew how to grow rice on upland farms, inside freshwater swamps, and near coastal land where a single rush of salt water could destroy an entire season. No planter in Carolina had invented those lessons. When European travelers saw African farmers working with hoes, some described their methods as backward because they did not resemble English agriculture. Heavy plows looked more advanced to European eyes, although those plows often failed in wet ground, crowded with tree roots and narrow banks. The African hoe was lighter, more precise, and far better suited to land where water had to be managed with care. The insult was written down, while the usefulness was quietly remembered. As rice became more important in Carolina during the early 18th century, Planters and slave traders began showing a preference for captives taken from African regions known for rice cultivation. Buyers wanted people who understood seed selection, swamp farming, water control, harvesting, threshing, and winnowing. The same society that described Africans as uncivilized was willing to pay for Africans whose experience could rescue its plantations. Enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic carrying agricultural knowledge that Carolina needed badly, while European ships also purchased African rice to feed captives and crews during the Middle Passage. The slave trade was using African rice before Carolina planters claimed the crop as their own. Carolina had land, rivers, and powerful investors, but those things had not yet produced the wealth its leaders wanted. Before rice could rescue the colony, someone had to understand the crop, the water, the soil, and the work. Much of that understanding arrived inside the memories of people who were sold as property, then pushed into the background of the very history they had made possible. Part 2. The Seeds. Hidden in her hair. Across generations, families in parts of West Africa had protected rice seed with the same care they gave to food, children, and the coming season. A few strong grains could decide whether a household planted again after flood, drought, or hunger. When women were captured and driven toward slave ships, some oral traditions say they braided rice and other seeds into their hair, hiding them where guards might not think to look. No surviving ship record gives us one woman's name, and no merchant wrote that he watched her hide those grains. The men keeping those records were interested in prices, insurance, cargo, and the number of captives still alive. A mother's effort to save a piece of home would not have mattered to them, even if those seeds later helped another community survive. The voyage across the Atlantic usually lasted several weeks, and bad weather could make it much longer. Men, women, and children were held in crowded spaces where illness spread quickly, families were torn apart, and survival often depended on chance. The ships carrying Africans into slavery were already depending on African rice. When survivors reached ports in the Americas, they arrived with more than the strength of their bodies. Rice farmers remembered how water should move through a field, how salt could ruin young plants when grain was ready to harvest, and how to remove the hull without destroying the food inside. Those skills had been learned over years, yet plantation owners could demand them without paying the people who carried them. A woman might be sold because an owner believed she understood rice, while the law still allowed him to separate her from her husband or children. Her knowledge could raise his harvest, increase his wealth, and strengthen the same system that had taken away her freedom. Historians remain careful about claiming that one braid of rice seed created Carolina's entire rice economy. The surviving evidence does not support such a simple beginning. The deeper truth is harder to dismiss. Seeds, food, and farming knowledge all crossed the Atlantic with African people, while later histories placed white captains and planters at the center of the story. The grains hidden in a woman's hair were small enough to miss, but the knowledge traveling with her was large enough to help change the American South. Part 3. Carolina took the knowledge and claimed the harvest. By the early 18th century, Carolina had finally found the crop its leaders had been chasing, but the people who knew how to grow it were being bought and sold. Rice was spreading through the Lowcountry, yet the land was not ready to receive it. Much of the coastal region was covered with forests, tangled roots, muddy swamps, and rivers that rose and fell with the tide. English settlers tried methods they already knew, including heavy plows and European field patterns. But those tools often failed in ground that could swallow wheels, trap blades, and drown young plants within hours. The breakthrough came from people whose names rarely entered the records. Enslaved Africans from rice-growing regions understood how to work with water instead of fighting it. They knew how to clear wet ground, raise banks, cut drainage channels, judge the danger of salt water, and prepare soil that looked useless to men who had never farmed a swamp. Their knowledge did not create one perfect system overnight because Carolina's landscape was different from West Africa. They had to adjust old experience to new rivers while working under threats, punishment, and constant pressure for larger harvests. By the 1720s, Carolina planters were actively asking slave traders for captives from the rice coast. The request itself exposed a truth they rarely admitted in public. These buyers were not simply looking for strong bodies. They were searching for farmers, water managers, seed keepers, and people who understood a crop that could save their failing colonial dream. When rice grew well, planters expanded the fields, demanded more labor, and purchased more captives from the same African regions. What may have begun on small plots became a growing plantation system, supported by colonial law and Atlantic trade. The people who supplied the skill were denied wages, property, legal protection, and any promise that their families would remain together. Later accounts praised white planters for turning swamp into wealth, while the workers who designed, dug, planted, harvested, and processed the crop appeared as background figures. Their knowledge was taken from their hands, turned into profit, and then described as plantation management. Carolina had not discovered how to make rice grow by itself. It had found people who already understood the crop, forced them to rebuild that knowledge under slavery, and placed the owner's name on everything that came from the field. Part 4. Carolina gold was built in mud, fever, and fear. By the middle of the 18th century, rice had turned from a risky crop into one of Carolina's greatest sources of wealth, and the grain that made planters rich became known as Carolina gold. The name suited its warm color and high value in Atlantic markets. Charleston grew richer as ships carried barrels of grain toward Europe and the Caribbean. Planters bought silver, imported furniture, and larger houses, while rice fortunes carried their families into politics and high society. The golden shine disappeared as soon as anyone stepped into the fields. Before a single harvest could be loaded onto a ship, enslaved workers had to remake the landscape with their own hands. Forests were cut down, roots were pulled from heavy soil, ditches were opened, banks were raised, and water channels were pushed through swamps where every step could sink into mud. Some historical estimates describe tens of thousands of acres cleared for rice and hundreds of miles of canals dug across the Lowcountry. Some accounts compare the earth moved there with material used for the pyramids of Giza. Exact comparisons remain difficult because plantation records are incomplete, but the scale itself is not in doubt. Entire river systems were reshaped by people who owned neither the land nor the crop growing from it. A worker might spend the morning standing in dark water, cutting through roots that had been buried for generations. By afternoon, the heat could become unbearable. Mosquitoes gathered around exposed skin, and the mud pulled against every step. Snakes and alligators were visible dangers, but disease killed far more quietly. Malaria and yellow fever were constant threats throughout the coastal region. Some West Africans carried forms of genetic protection against severe malaria, while others may have developed partial resistance after growing up in places where the disease was common. Planters twisted those facts into the claim that black people were naturally suited to swamp labor. Whatever protection some workers carried, nobody was protected from suffering or death. Enslaved men and women endured fever, weakness, repeated illness, and early death. Pregnant women worked under the same heat and insects, while parents watched children fall sick in a place where medical care depended on whether an owner believed a life was worth preserving. During the most dangerous seasons, wealthy families often left the plantations for healthier areas. Yet the workers who kept the rice fields alive remained behind. The owner could escape the fever without surrendering the profit. Controlling water made the plantation system even more demanding for exhausted workers. Rice fields had to be flooded and drained at the right time, because too much water could drown young plants while salt water could destroy an entire crop. Wooden gates, ditches, banks, and reservoirs required constant repair from workers. One broken wall after a storm could erase months of labor, so enslaved workers learned every weak corner of the fields. They knew which channel filled first, which bank leaked after heavy rain, and where the tide moved too quickly. That close knowledge came from long hours of observation. Yet plantation records usually describe the land as though it responded to the owner's skill alone. Many rice plantations used the task system, which assigned each worker a fixed amount of labor for the day. When a task was finished, a person might use the remaining time to grow food, fish, make baskets, repair clothing, or visit relatives living nearby. These hours gave families a small space to care for one another and preserve parts of their own lives. Those precious hours offered relief, although they never came close to freedom. The owner still decided how large each task would be, and overseers could punish anyone judged too slow. Private gardens often became necessary because plantation rations were poor. A mother finishing her assigned work early might hurry to a small plot so she could grow something for her children before darkness covered the field. Even a few hours of rest had to be earned after forced labor. As rice exports increased, the plantation system gathered enough money to expand itself. More rice brought more money, and more money allowed planters to buy more land and more enslaved people. The knowledge that helped a crop survive was used to enlarge the very machinery that kept its farmers captive. By the American Revolution, rice had made South Carolina one of British North America's wealthiest colonies. That wealth appeared in city houses, political influence, and family estates that carried planter names for generations. The people who dug the canals, repaired the banks, processed the grain, and buried loved ones lost to disease rarely appeared beside those fortunes. A barrel of Carolina gold could reach a distant table without carrying the name of a single worker who had made it possible. This quiet separation allowed the plantation economy to hide its terrible human cost. Buyers saw a valuable grain, merchants saw a growing market, and owners saw another successful season. Beneath every calculation stood families whose time, health, and knowledge had been taken without payment, while the law treated their suffering as a private matter belonging to the owner. The fields looked golden at harvest, but the path to that color ran through mud, fever, fear, and generations of people who were never allowed to claim the wealth rising around them. Part 5. How Carolina erased the people who made it rich. By the time Carolina gold had made planters wealthy, another kind of work had already begun: the careful removal of African people from the story of rice. The erasure did not usually arrive through one official order. It entered through family histories, plantation records, newspaper articles, agricultural reports, and school lessons that praised the men who owned the fields while saying almost nothing about the people who understood them. One familiar story became especially useful to later generations of writers. According to a popular account, a sea captain brought a small bag of rice from Madagascar to Carolina during the late 17th century and gave it to a local Englishman, often identified as Henry Woodward. The seed grew well. Neighbors planted more, and the rice economy supposedly began from that lucky gift. The story was easy to remember because it offered a named white man, a generous captain, a valuable seed, and a successful experiment. It also removed the need to explain why Carolina buyers later searched for enslaved Africans from regions with centuries of rice-growing experience. A bag of seed could cross an ocean without speaking, which made it a convenient hero. African farmers raised harder questions about who taught whom, whose knowledge created the harvest, and why the people with the greatest experience received no share of the wealth. Giving them proper credit would have forced later generations to admit that plantation success depended on stolen labor and stolen knowledge. Plantation records also helped keep that uncomfortable truth safely out of sight. Owners appeared by name because they signed contracts, purchased land, shipped rice, and passed property to their children. Enslaved workers often appeared only as first names, numbers, ages, prices, or short descriptions of physical condition. A woman could spend 30 years selecting seed, watching tides, teaching younger workers, and saving damaged crops after storms. Yet an account book might preserve more detail about a broken tool than about her life. If her child was sold away, the transaction could be recorded as income, while the family's grief remained outside the page. Agricultural writers also described plantation work in language that made human skill almost invisible. Fields were said to have been cleared, banks were said to have been built, and rice was said to have been pounded and winnowed. Those calm sentences hid the people lifting axes, carrying mud, swinging wooden pestles and shaking grain through baskets for hours. Rice processing gives us one of the clearest examples available. After cutting and drying the crop, workers separated the grain from its outer covering with large wooden mortars and pestles, then winnowed it in carefully made baskets. Similar basket-making traditions existed in West Africa, and their influence remains visible among Gullah Geechee communities in the Lowcountry. A basket could survive as a beautiful symbol of Southern culture, while the woman who made it remained unknown. The same pattern of erasure also entered the plantation kitchen. Enslaved cooks combined rice with okra, peas, sesame, seafood, and local ingredients, helping shape dishes that later became part of Southern identity. Guests praised plantation tables, while the cook standing near the fire was rarely invited into the story. By the time later generations inherited these plantations, the original violence had often been softened into a family success story. Grand houses were admired for their architecture. Silver was displayed as evidence of refinement, and portraits showed confident owners surrounded by the things rice money had purchased. The canals beyond the house remained visible, yet the people who dug them were treated as background. Schools repeated the simpler version because it was easier to teach. A captain brought rice, planters improved the land, Charleston became rich, and the colony prospered. Each sentence contained part of the truth, but together they allowed children to learn about the crop, without learning what happened to the families who made it profitable. That silence protected more than reputations because it also protected inheritance. The wealth created by rice did not vanish when one planter died. Land, houses, political connections, and business opportunities passed to descendants. Enslaved families received no matching inheritance from the knowledge they had supplied. Many inherited separation, poverty, and records so thin that descendants today still struggle to recover their ancestors' names. Gullah Geechee communities kept more of the truth alive through language, food, basketry, farming practices, and family memory. Their survival made it harder for the old plantation story to remain complete, because the knowledge had not disappeared, even when official histories pushed it aside. When historians returned to shipping records, advertisements, African agricultural history, and the physical remains of rice fields, the familiar legend began to look painfully incomplete. No single woman, captain, or planter created the entire rice economy. What emerged instead was a larger story about African expertise, forced migration, adaptation, and a plantation system designed to turn every useful skill into someone else's property. The theft continued after the rice was sold, because the harvest entered history under the owner's name, while the people who made it possible were left without wages, land, legal protection, or a clear place in the story. Carolina gold gave the colony a fortune counted in barrels, acres, houses, and political power. The full cost was carried by families whose knowledge saved the crop, whose bodies endured the fields, and whose names were allowed to fade once their work had made other people rich. The next time rice reaches your table, remember the African hands that carried its knowledge across an ocean, then watched others claim the harvest. Their names deserve more than silence. Share this story, subscribe to Hidden Black Chronicles, and help keep their memory alive for generations.